Welcome to Free Speech Nation, the podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. My guest today is Matthew Goodwin. Matthew is Professor of Politics at Kent University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Legatum Institute. He's the author of many books, including recently National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. We had a fantastic conversation. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about the way in which the culture war is being imported from America. We talked about academic freedom and much, much more besides. I hope you enjoy our conversation. So thank you very much for joining me today, Matthew. I wanted to start by asking you about populism. You've written a book, National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. I think a lot of people consider the notion of populism to be a dirty word, or certainly that's the way it's used. It's often used with derision or scorn in the media. Can you explain why that might be and what you feel it means?
Yeah, I think to understand populism, we sort of have to step back and just think about where the debate over populism really came from. And I think a lot of the discussion of populism has filtered through the university debate and academic debate about populism. And historically, to be frank, that debate has been dominated by people who tend to be very much on the left of the political spectrum, and who have often equated populism with terms like far right, fascism, neo-fascism, anti-immigration, and actually that research has been a highly politicized body of research, and that's where I came from historically as a young PhD student, and was struck really at the failure of academics to really think about some of the other reasons why people might be supporting these parties. And I think if you sort of look at why we're in this sort of populist moment today, I think that really takes us into looking at some of the grievances that are driving these movements that actually aren't about, fascism and extremism. There is certainly a minority of people who vote for populist parties who hold very unsavory views and are quite authoritarian. But actually, these movements tend to be drawing their support from what I would argue are quite acceptable, quite legitimate grievances around the failure of political systems to give voice to working class non-graduate voices, the failure of political elites to recognize viewpoint diversity within societies, to accept that concerns over the pace and scale of migration are entirely legitimate, and also to address the fact that lots of people feel that they're not just suffering from objective economic inequality, but actually are suffering from relative inequality, that compared to other groups, their group is being left behind. And so one of the reasons Roger Ewell and I wrote the book National Populism was to basically try and present a more nuanced case about what this movement is and where it has come from, and to try and get away from this very simplistic binary conversation that we have, which is populism equals fascism. And that, for a start, is only really encouraging more people to vote for populist parties. And it's also really not a good reflection of the empirical evidence that we now have on why people are actually voting for these parties.
Well, I mean, it's also historically illiterate. This is not what fascism means. And it's interesting. What you've said raises a really interesting question, I think, which is that you've there clearly outlined a range of potential grievances that people might have that are completely legitimate, that don't equate to far-right beliefs. So why is it that so many members of the commentariat and universities interpret this as, or how can I put it, interpret it in the least generous way possible?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. I think, firstly, many of the institutions, many of the sort of forums in which we talk about politics are very homogenous ideologically. They lean very strongly in one direction. So it's a political game to sane people who vote for Brexit, for example, as being xenophobic and racist. I think also it's wrapped up intimately with status and the role that status now plays in Western societies. I think for many white liberal graduates, social status today has become intimately wrapped up with the embrace of what you might call progressive, even woke views, and people who vote for things like Brexit, or even who vote for the Conservative Party, are increasingly on the wrong side of that belief system, and so are portrayed as being sort of racist little Englanders who want to restore the empire and return to the 1950s. There's almost no evidence to support that assertion. And I think also it's just a lot of people not really reading the research and reading history, as you suggest. I mean, most of the populist movements in Western democracies today are not revolutionary. Fascists were revolutionary. They wanted to overthrow not just liberalism, but they wanted to completely overthrow capitalism and democracy. They did not hide that fact. And they were also, I think, deeply fixated on anti-Semitism, and they were not comfortable with the market economy. And I think if you look at what we've seen across much of Europe at the moment, and also I would argue across much of North America, is something quite different. I think populists are more reactionary than revolutionary. They want to change the system, modify the system, but they don't want to completely overthrow it. They're fairly comfortable actually with capitalism as an economic system, and they've broadly accepted democracy. Now they do advocate a different conception of democracy. They advocate direct democracy. They want more attention paid to the popular will, to the majority, and they want less attention being paid to the procedures of government, a sort of liberal conception of democracy. But those differences, I would argue, are really important because they actually force us to accept that lots of the people that have been voting for these political upheavals have very good reasons for doing so. I mean, the blunt reality, as we can all see, is over the last half century, Western liberal democracy and the capitalist system have not worked very well for large groups of people. And the people who have been running those societies have often been running them in a way that has not been very responsive to people's concerns, especially people who do not share their liberal progressive views on issues like multiculturalism, diversity, and cosmopolitanism. And I think that, has left ample space for these movements to really become permanent features of the political landscape.
Yeah, I mean, just to bring it back to the universities, insofar as I understand what you're saying, but to me, I'm always still confused as to why it is. I mean, you gave the example of the attitudes, the reasons why people voted for Brexit. And so often we heard in the media that people wanted to restore the days of empire. And that's just not a thing. There is no one who has that view. And yet somehow, and we can see that, we can see there's no evidence for it. And academics of all people should be interested in the pursuit of truth. And they see this and they I can't work out whether it's willful or whether they are kind of sharing this sort of mass delusion, or if it's what you hinted at there, which is this idea of preference falsification, insofar as there is a high status opinion. There is an opinion to have that will make you higher than others, or more popular, or more respected. And it's not necessarily the opinion you hold, but you will seize that opinion anyway and wear it and signal it. I mean, is that what's going on here, or am I engaging in a bit of cod psychology here, which I shouldn't do?
I think it's part of the explanation. I think Rob Henderson, among others, has written about this very eloquently, that we now have, in effect, an intellectual class that has turned progressive ideology, some might call it woke ideology, into a luxury belief system. So they are accruing status by offering interpretations of the world in this way that not only send a signal to their fellow elites that they see the world this way and they're trying to acquire further status by projecting that view, but they're also, and this is the most important part, they're trying to firmly disassociate themselves from who they perceive to be low status groups in society. Right. And those groups include non-graduates, the working class, people who vote for Brexit, and so forth. And that, I think, has really, really accelerated, in particular in the UK since the vote for Brexit. It's accelerated in the US since the Trump presidency. And the evidence on this is overwhelming. I mean, Zach Goldberg, among others, has shown actually how after 2016, white graduate liberals have basically drifted away from everybody else in society, have doubled down on their pro-multiculturalism, pro-diversity views. And I think have done that partly as a way of really reaffirming their sense of social status, disassociating themselves from others. And when you look at some of the arguments that have been offered by the Academy in the UK for Brexit, particularly arguments that focus on things like empire, I think partly also this is actually how they see the world. They have always historically had a problem with England, mainly because lots of the academics who have made those arguments have come from Scotland, Wales, and Ireland or Northern Ireland, and have, I think, really pushed this trope that actually at the root of this is English nationalism, is a sort of backwards, xenophobic, ignorant ideology that is basically consumed with throwing the immigrants out returning to 1950 to when divorce was illegal and abortion wasn't allowed and same-sex relationships were not permissible, and all of these things. There is almost no empirical evidence to support that, I would argue. But what it does is it really sort of offers us an insight into actually how parts of the academy view many of their fellow citizens. It also reminds us, I would argue, of just how culturally detached many intellectuals actually have become. This isn't a new thing, of course. George Orwell talked about it in 1940, but what we've seen since then, I think, is quite a rapid transformation of the universities, whereby in the 1960s, people on the left outnumbered people on the right by around 3 to 1. Today, that's spiraled to about 9 to 1, 10 to 1, depending on what survey you look at. So as the academy sort of become more detached, in particular from the groups who have actually been voting for things like Brexit or voting for Boris Johnson, that gap has become so wide that they're no longer really able to sort of relate to the real grievances and the motivations that are driving large numbers of voters. And that finds its expression through some of these, to be blunt, ridiculous arguments that we've had about Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. You mentioned this idea of wanting to disassociate yourself from certain individuals. That is a trope that I see again and again, insofar as, if I support free speech, someone will point at a very reactionary kind of far right figure who also supports free speech and say, do you really want to be on the same side as that person? But of course, I would say that person is wrong about almost everything. But when it comes to free speech, that person's right. And it's, and of course, that person likely is supporting free speech for disingenuous reasons anyway. So, I mean, yeah, but the guilt by association thing is very prevalent. It's just a shame that they should have seeped into the academy. And I think you will know this more than anyone as someone who was one of the few open academics in support of Brexit. I mean, it was overwhelming, wasn't it? And I mean, I feel a kinship here because I was one of the handful of comedians who was pro-Brexit. I mean, I think you could have counted us on one hand, to be honest, and probably the same with academics. Am I right?
I think that's true. I was a sort of rare creature in academia. I didn't campaign publicly for Brexit. I wouldn't really have described myself as a Brexiteer before the referendum. But in the aftermath, my view was people have voted for it. Let's accept it. Let's implement it. Let's work with it. And then as we went through 2017, 18, and 19. I became actually quite appalled at the reaction of many of my colleagues, but also wider society.
It's shocking. You're standing up for democracy there. You're saying you believe in the democratic process. How is that the controversial position?
But you see, that journey for somebody in my shoes, about 10% of academics would be in that camp, I think has been very revealing in itself, because I now divide my career into pre-Brexit and post-Brexit. Pre-Brexit was fine. Everybody was very friendly and nice. Post-Brexit, you are essentially seen as a pariah, as somebody who is sort of tantamount to, sort of almost evil, in the sort of moralistic way in which liberals tend to view the world around them. Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind, among other studies, has pointed to this, that liberals tend to view the world through a deeply moralistic lens. Conservatives, and I would say I'm a fairly moderate conservative, I actually lean a bit left on the economy. I voted for Labour at some elections in the past, but nonetheless, conservatives tend to see things more through the lens of pragmatism, through sort of what works, and some of my colleagues are very moralistic in how they see the world around them. So if you've violated this sacred value, which is European integration, which is cosmopolitanism, you are essentially then damaged goods. Now, if you're a professor, that's okay, because you can carry on and you can't really get sacked and so forth. But if you're a lecturer or a temporary lecturer, or somebody on a fixed term contract, or somebody who aspires to climb the ladder to become a professor one day, if you violate those sacred values, it's essentially game over. It's not impossible to rise to the top, but it's very, very difficult, because you are seen as violating that monoculture. And I do firmly believe, actually, that it is now, in some institutions especially, an ideological monoculture. And that is deeply problematic, because as Cass Sunstein and others have shown, when you have these monocultures where you don't have any viewpoint diversity, what tends to happen is people radicalize over time, because there's nobody really to check their ideological priors. There's nobody to challenge them. And I think after Brexit, we saw that in our universities, where the vast majority of pro-Remain academics became so sort of committed in their view, so outraged, that they sort of felt like it was completely acceptable to sort of pile on their colleagues who had said, actually, we think we should respect and implement this vote. And it was quite appalling. And I would say that just by way of background, I have never had as many emails from people saying, look, I wish I could say publicly that I supported this, or I wish I could say publicly that I voted for this, including, ironically, a lot of people in Oxbridge. But they feel they can't do so because of the career consequences. And we're not talking about something that is extremist. We're talking about leaving the European Union, which is actually a mainstream view. But that's the insight into the world that we're in.
It's a very depressing picture that you paint there. Before I carry on, because I want to talk a bit more about the universities and this monoculture that you describe, but I've heard you often refer to liberals and liberalism. And, I've always considered myself to be a liberal because I believe in liberal values. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of the press, evidence-based epistemology, the idea of, these basic fundamental liberal truths. Does that not make me a liberal?
Yes, I think it does. I think liberal encompasses a lot of people. When I refer to moralistic liberal-minded people, I should probably be more specific in my language. I'm mainly referring to liberal progressives, which I view as a sort of subgroup within. And in some respects, they're not actually that liberal. But
that's what I mean, I suppose. That's
progressives are who we would sort of call today sort of woke activists. And there's a lot of emerging evidence now on that particular group, that they come from very privileged backgrounds. They tend to have above average income. Their parents tend to be graduates. They tend to live in the cities and university towns. They are very active on social media, far more so than the national average. They are consumed by the idea that Britain and other Western societies are racist societies, and they are obsessed with historic injustices, sometimes for good reason. I mean, the one thing that makes me rather anxious about the debate around sort of wokeism, if you like, is I think in some of it there is an assumption that these are bad people. I don't actually think that. I think many of my progressive colleagues have good intentions, but I think they've sort of latched onto an ideology that is hardwired to actually cause more division than it is to bring people together. And so this obsession with historic injustices and what happened, 200, 300 years ago is partly a reflection of that, as is their much wider definition of racism. So they hold a really expanded definition of racism, a sort of concept creep, if you like, that includes entirely legitimate things such as, voting for Brexit or voting for the Conservatives. In the eyes of the progressive mindset, that is tantamount to blasphemy. John McWhorter in the US and others have talked about this group as being almost religious, in how they see the world, in holding views that are quite religious in tone and being very, very hostile to this idea of viewpoint diversity that I do believe is fundamentally central to any university experience, which is having people in universities teaching students who hold very different views. And if we lose that, then we're in deep trouble.
It does strike me as having religious overtones. I mean, everything that you've described is this notion of heresy, really. And sometimes they inadvertently borrow the language of religiosity. I don't suppose you saw the viral video the other day of the protesters outside of Netflix. Someone was holding up a sign saying that he found Dave Chappelle funny, and a woman was screaming in his face, "Repent, repent." I mean, actually using the words of religiosity. I mean, that strikes me as incredible. And so I think in that extent, it is fair, is not, to say that this is a kind of a religion, or certainly a fundamentalist religion that appears to have captured some of the most intelligent people in our society. And that maybe is the danger.
I think there's a lot of truth to the description of the progressive movement, the more radical end of that progressive movement, as being very religious in tone. Think about all of the things that we can see. Firstly, the way that texts are used. So key books around race and anti-racism that are treated as religious texts that need to be distributed around schools and universities, even though many of the claims in those books are really lacking in empirical evidence. Now, I was trained during my PhD to say any claims need to be supported by empirical evidence. We need to really test them. They need to be falsifiable. We need to really, subject them to social science scrutiny. That now seems to have gone out of the window. So we've embraced all of these very dubious concepts, unconscious bias testing, white privilege, institutional racism. All of these things are now taken as gospel, when in fact, we really don't have a lot of evidence to support them. That makes me particularly nervous. And also the way in which alternative views, alternative values are not allowed into the marketplace of ideas anymore, are stigmatized as being unacceptable, illegitimate, and so forth. And that too is very pronounced in the very institutions that are supposed to be educating and training and developing the rounded critical thinkers of tomorrow, namely our universities. So this religious aspect, I think, is deeply worrying. I do think, and we might come on to talk about this, I do think the tide may be turning in some important ways against that mindset. I think even, I would use the word moderates in the progressive camp, who are not part of that sort of 13 to 15%, which is roughly what that sort of woke progressive group represent in Britain. There's a wider group, a sort of moderate group that kind of sympathise with them on some issues, but also accept that they're slightly crazy on some issues. And I think actually taking that moderate group along with in this conversation about where the radicals are going wrong, I think is absolutely crucial, because if you lose that moderate group, then it's going to be very difficult.
Can I ask how you've quantified that 13 to 15%? Because I've always been fully aware that this is a minority, an elite who are pulling the strings here. And the reason that they have so much sway is, firstly, that they have, captured so many of our major institutions, but also because they're damned intimidating. And they are the ones who would burn you at the stake if they could, right? So that's why they win. Ultimately, you only need 2 or 3 woke people in any organization for the whole thing to fall, right? But how did you find that figure? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so we have 2 recent studies that actually come up with 2 different figures. So we have a study by Moore and Common, who use a very large-scale survey segmentation analysis. They estimate that in Britain, the progressive activist base, the sort of woke base, is about 13%. A separate study at King's puts it a bit higher, about 20%. Now, instinctively, that feels closer to where we are than the 13% to me, for other reasons that I've seen in the surveys. But I think you're still looking at a clear minority. Now, but the challenge, in my mind at least, is that even though we're talking about a minority, they are disproportionately represented in key institutions. So, parts of the media, parts of universities, in particular public sector organizations, local government, and so on. And they then tend to be so vocal, and the evidence backs this up. They're very vocal on social media, right? They're very often very influential within their organizations. They tend to be quite senior. I think as a consequence, the sort of influence is amplified. And when radicals speak, moderates tend to be very anxious about shouting them down. Now, interestingly, I think we have had a number of test cases, and I know we'll come on to talk about Kathleen Stock. I think Kathleen is one test case, but there have been a number of other cases in UK universities over the last couple of years, I think also in parts of the media, that have made even left-leaning moderates think, actually, I think these progressives are a bit crazy. I think the treatment of Noah Carl, a young researcher who was suddenly sacked from the University of Cambridge, from one of the most prestigious institutions, was a really interesting case, whereby a lot of mainstream, non-woke, if you like, academics felt that was really, really not on. The disinvitation of Jordan Peterson from the University of Cambridge, the disinvitation of Amber Rudd, and now the treatment of Kathleen Stock at the University of Sussex. All of this is sort of sending a signal to the 80% that actually, there is a group now that is incredibly intolerant of alternative perspectives. And I think also, to be blunt, a lot of people have realized that this is causing serious reputational damage, and it is actually harming their institutions and harming the reputation of their profession. And when you're dealing with people who are largely obsessed with status, that in itself may actually have quite a strong impact.
I mean, I am heartened when I see things like that. For instance, the University of Sussex being so vocal in its defence of Kathleen Stock and the right for academic freedom. And then with Jordan Peterson, similarly, the Goodwin and Keyes, I think, are now inviting him again after all this time. And so that, to me, seems that there are sort of signs that things are moving in that direction. But then for every time there is these little victories, there's all this other tsunami of nonsense that comes back the other way. And it doesn't feel... looking at it in an overall picture, it doesn't necessarily feel that things are being rectified. And one of the questions I always get from people is, when is all this going to end? Most people just want it to go away, because most people, as you said, the 80% just think this is nonsense. This has got to stop.
If you're serious about tackling political polarization, on the sort of mad far right end of the spectrum, but also the radical progressive end. And I do actually think they both present serious challenges. You've got to get the moderates in the room to feel empowered to stand up and actually push back against these groups. Now, how do you do that? I think one starting point is simply to expose how crazy the world is becoming. And I think in the US, where they are, I think, a few years ahead of us in this debate. I think the UK is quickly following America, but they are a few years ahead of us. I think you can begin to see the way in which the debate over how we teach race and how we discuss racism in schools and universities is an example now of the mainstreaming of this debate. I think when you look at what's happening around the teaching of critical race theory in universities, when you look at the impact that defund the police and similar initiatives have had on actual rates of crime, and now a recognition that actually this has had a very negative impact, including on the lives of African Americans. I think now, those debates are beginning to sort of open up a room to have a serious discussion about what this particular worldview is about and where it's going to take us, in the same way that I think in the UK, we had a very early glimpse of that when the government released the race disparity report, and the way in which, merely by pointing to a more nuanced, complex story around the relative performance, the relative life chances of different minority groups, that was seen by the sort of, progressive radical end as blasphemy. You're not allowed to point to the fact that actually white working class kids are the bottom of the table when it comes to educational outcomes, and Chinese and Indian kids are doing really, really well. You're not allowed to point to the remarkable progress that has been made in social mobility among a large number of minority ethnic groups over the last half century. I think that was a real trailer to where the UK is going over the next 5 to 10 years, which is, are we willing to paint a nuanced story of what's happening, an evidence-led story of what's happening, or are we going to, sort of continue to perpetuate this deeply ideological, very simplistic, and actually quite pernicious view of the world? I think, sadly, we will probably end up following America's path on that.
You mentioned the race disparity report there. I think it's very interesting because the response to it was very much this kind of just flat out denial without any substance. And then you read, the Runnymede report, the Runnymede Trust coming back at it, and it is just assertion piled on assertion, and it's all sort of rooted in faith. And it's as though they take their assumptions first and work backwards from that conclusion. And that, to me, is why it's going to be so difficult, I think, to push beyond this, is because so many of the advocates of, say, critical race theory, all these ideas of these invisible power structures that dominate society, are impervious to data. They're just not interested in that.
Yeah, and even if you are the author of a study that happens to show that the reality of life in Britain is more complex than some of those interpretations would have us believe, typically the reaction is to then undermine and discredit that particular researcher as being a voice that cannot be trusted, or somebody who's violated the sacred values of equality through diversity. And that's a real problem. I mean, I've got lots of colleagues. I used to have a lot of respect for them. They talked a lot about social science and the need to, get at causality and draw on reliable evidence and so on. But then we'll sort of step back from challenging, some of these ideological principles, and I think that's just a betrayal of what we're about. We're not here to push an ideological view. We're here to search for truth and to use evidence to get at that. And as a consequence, then we just sort of enter this make-believe world that sort of isn't really a true reflection of reality. And of course, partly that's what its architects intended us to be in when they started pushing some of these arguments half a century ago. But it's deeply worrying. I mean, if you look at Britain as an example, you could tell a very different story about Britain over the last half century. Over the last century, you could tell a story that is about a remarkable a story of progress among different minority groups, a story of collapsing levels of racial prejudice since the 1980s, a story since Brexit of a country that has become overwhelmingly more positive about migration and has become much more tolerant on almost every serious, rigorous, reliable measure that we have. Now, if we were staying true to our word and we believed in empirical evidence, we would be pointing to a lot of that. But there is a nervousness in pointing to the good news, right? Because now we are hardwired to obsess about the sort of bad news and to paint this picture of Britain as being somehow comparable to the United States. And secondly, as being a country that is overwhelmingly negative, that is obsessed with painting, the worst possible story of the country. And it's just a very unfortunate place to be, because that also then strips a lot of groups of their sense of agency. It encourages this culture of victimhood that we've slid into, whereby you acquire status now by becoming a victim rather than an individual with your own sense of agency. You can change the world around you, and we're stripping away individual personal responsibility. So it's just easier to say you're part of a homogenous group that's being victimized by invisible power structures, and that is not, I don't think, a particularly good place for us to be as a society. And it's a very depressing place to be, because it sort of strips away a lot of effort and a lot of work that people have invested over many decades. But that is ultimately the view that radical progressives want to push. And many of the people that fall into those ideas, as you know, I think are good intentioned, nice people. But I'm not entirely convinced that they fully understand the roots of the ideology that they are pushing by extension, and that is one of the big problems.
Well, it comes back to this idea that there is a kernel of truth in the things that they say. In other words, racism has not been eradicated in our society. It does still exist. People are still subjected to discrimination, and therefore, if you are seen to be painting a positive picture of the triumph of social liberalism since the civil rights movement, then people might be suspicious of that. They might be saying, "Are you trying to deny the oppression that certain people still face?" And I suppose that's the problem, isn't it?
It's not one or the other. I think we're able to say, yes, there is still racism, and here is an example of it. But there's also context, and there is also a positive story to tell about the country today, which is this. And I think we've lost that balance. We've lost that sense of nuance. Instead, we're sort of running at 200 miles an hour at the negative story, which is often actually, in some cases, is not truly representative of the country. I mean, I was thinking about this during the football tournament in the summer, and suddenly the main narrative became, look how racist Britain is, in the space of about 48 hours.
Yes.
And actually, the opportunity there to tell a very different story of the country was just completely lost. And that alternative story is Brits have become much more inclusive in how they think about their national identity. They no longer really think about it in terms of race and ethnicity. Levels of racism, by every rigorous measure that we have collapsed since the 1980s. Marcus Rashford and that generation have grown up in a much more tolerant country than their parents and their grandparents. Now, of course, they would fire back, well, look at all of the abuse that I receive on social media. And of course, the problem is the smaller number of out-and-out racists that we have in our society, their voice has been amplified on Twitter and Facebook. And so we've sort of entered this reality that is actually quite complex and doesn't always reflect the reality of the country overall. And that story, I would still argue, is an incredibly positive story. It is a country that has become much more welcoming and much more tolerant over time. But one side of this debate does have, I think, a vested interest in pushing a very different narrative, which is
that's a very good example of the kind of thing we're talking about, because instead of as you say, all the studies point in the same direction and tell us a very positive story about race relations in this country, and yet automatically when there were these horrible tweets, and they were vile, but there weren't many in the grand scheme of things. If you take the number of people who watched the football match, and most of them came from abroad anyway. But to take that a small number, a handful of absolute ghastly people, and it's the step I don't understand, is to go from there to, well, this must be reflective of the whole country. This must be the reflective of everyone. Similarly, if I suffer discrimination, then I must assume that the whole country is systemically homophobic or whatever. So it's that leap from the individual's experience, which can be appalling, and then to extrapolate from that and make a judgment about the whole of society. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think it comes from a number of trends that have been building over the last 50 years. I think one is a sort of turn towards the emphasis on lived experience over evidence and objective reality. I mean, you know, we could talk for hours about the roots of the underlying ideology, but I think one of the big shifts, you know, beginning in the 60s was the sort of so-called therapeutic turn in Western societies that really began to focus on the individual need for recognition and the individual's focus on the importance of lived experience. And that really has I think, encouraged society to focus overwhelmingly on subjective feelings over sometimes the importance of objective truth and empirical evidence. And, you know, a lot of scholars recently have been talking about this. Francis Fukuyama has talked about it. Mark Liller has talked about it. And I think that's been amplified by many movements on the left of politics who have sort of then embraced this view and have sort of latched into this identity politics to try and kind of reinforce that need for recognition among different minority groups. And so they no longer they're no longer offering the unifying narratives that we used to have as a country. I mean, if you go back to the 50s, the 40s, 50s, we had these big unifying narratives around citizenship, around social patriotism, believing in the country, believing in its institutions, not uncritically, but nonetheless, we had a shared story about who we are. And I think, you know, since the 60s, from different angles, we've had this worldview that is very focused on dismantling that sense of unity and that shared story. And we sort of collapsed into this much more fragmented narrative that is overwhelmingly focused on minority groups, that's overwhelmingly focused on the culture of victimhood, is much less interested in objective evidence and truth, has really gone quite mainstream, has sort of filtered into not just, you know, universities, but media, public sector organizations, and so on. And I think is now sort of you know, really focused on trying to satisfy this idea of emotional safety, in particular for younger generations, or Zoomers and millennials. So now it's really a culture of safetyism that's taken root, that you cannot be harmed by these views and ideas that you disagree with. And it's all, I think, really conflated. And it's brought us into this place where I think a lot of people feel that they can't say what they really think. A lot of academics and researchers in my world feel that they can't challenge some of these sacred values. And there's now a vested interest, in a way, as you're incentivized to see yourself either as a victim or as an oppressor of those victims, in which case you need to apologize for that, whether you need to apologize for your white privilege or your white guilt or your whiteness, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've got this new status hierarchy in society, which is very simplistic, very binary. You're either good or bad. You're racist or anti-racist. You're an oppressor or you're a victim. And that's a very dark place, I think, for a society to be, especially a society that's rapidly diversifying ethnically, culturally, religiously, you know, on all of these dimensions. Our society is becoming more complex, not less complex. And then we've sort of set up this bizarre structure which encourages people to see themselves on one of two sides. I mean, that to me is a recipe for a much more serious problem going forward. And I'd like to see somebody either in politics or academia or the media or so on. I'd like to see somebody start to get back to these unifying narratives that actually cut across the boundaries of different groups. And that is, I think, the primary political challenge of where we are.
And this this disparity between I suppose reality and the kind of pseudo reality, which is advanced by activists and academics, or activist academics, because they often are conflated. This, I think, we have seen very clearly in the case of Kathleen Stock, and I want to come back to this because I just think this is a really, as you say, a very important test case. And you know, I endlessly get into arguments with people about issues such as this, such as the representation of the LGB Alliance, you know, whenever, or J.K. Rowling, whenever I say to people, can you please quote something transphobic that J.K. Rowling has said or the LGB Alliance has said? And no one ever can. It's just equivocation and you know, ungenerous readings of what they've said. And there's no evidence whatsoever. And yet the narrative is so accepted to the point that people I know and respect and I consider to be very intelligent will say, oh, the LGB Alliance is a transphobic hate group. No evidence. They've just accepted that narrative. And similarly with Kathleen Stock, I think Kathleen Stock is a particularly egregious case, because if you read her book, her Material Girls, if you know anything about what she's said and done, she's actually one of the most sort of calm and compassionate and not a provocateur by any stretch of the imagination. It seems like an odd thing that she would be the one who is targeted to such an extent.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I agree with you on Kathleen. I think her arguments are very balanced. I think she's careful to always talk from the point of view of evidence. And she's certainly not a provocateur who's gone out of her way to create this current moral panic, if you like. But nonetheless, she has violated one of the sacred values in universities. And when you violate a sacred value and you violate the progressive worldview, then you are treated accordingly.
What is that value? What is that value that she's broken?
You are shunned on. Well, if you don't subscribe to the particular view of gender identity and the relationship between sex and gender that is held by a group within British society, I would argue certainly not a majority of British society, then you're persona non grata, especially in an institution that tends to be 95%, 98% leaning in one particular way. Kathleen Stock, what was interesting about the case for me, firstly, was this case could have gone completely differently. What was interesting about this case was the Vice-Chancellor stood up very early on. The Vice-Chancellor that is leaving the university, by the way, I think is about to move on, or I think is moving to a different institution, which again, I think was an important piece of context. So, he wouldn't have to stick around to deal with the consequences so much. But nonetheless, quickly stood up and said, actually, I think Kathleen Stock has a right to say what she says in her books. Had that Vice-Chancellor taken the opposite view, and we know now that the trade union branch at the university was pretty openly critical of Kathleen Stock when, in fact, they should have defended an academic in that case, then things could have been very, very different for Kathleen Stock. I think it's still an incredibly depressing situation to have an academic being essentially chased off campus, harassed and intimidated, and having been given advice by police as to how to handle her security in modern Britain, I think is shameful. But it's not the only case. I mean, we have the study at King's that suggests 1/4 of university students are now scared to express what they really think. We have a study by UCU, the trade union for academics, which has sort of denied, in the past that there is an issue. Their own survey shows that 1 in 3 academics feel that they cannot express their views because they are worried about the impact that will have on their career progression. And for every Kathleen Stock, I can give you a Noah Carl, I can give you a Neil Thin, I can give you a Jordan Peterson, et cetera, et cetera. And the argument, one of the silver linings in this case, and I hate to say that because I know that Kathleen Stock has gone through hell, there is a silver lining in this case, which is that it is no longer credible to say that we do not have a problem in universities. That argument is no longer credible.
I was going to ask you about that because I think I hear that
that was still being pushed by many of my colleagues on Twitter.
Yeah,
who say this is all make believe. This is all a sort of a plot that's being produced by right-wing academics to discredit universities, and clearly now everybody can see it. Everybody can see it. It's out in the open. We have a serious problem. We need to deal with it. And thankfully, the government actually has taken action to deal with it.
You wrote a piece for Unheard that I read about the way in which the American culture wars are effectively being imported here. And this does raise a few problems, doesn't it? Because America has, as you point out, a completely different history. And it's, for instance, with the way that we import critical race theory into schools here is actually incoherent. Given that we don't have the history of segregation and slavery that they have. That's not to say the British Empire wasn't complicit in slavery. What I mean is, it's a very different history that we have. So why has that happened? And you said earlier that you think we're going down the American route and we're a few years behind America. Can you talk us through, develop that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, so we have a number of studies and reports over the last 2 or 3 years. One at university, one at King's College London, another by Centre for Policy Studies. We have a lot of research in my discipline of political science, which has shown really since Brexit we've become a lot more polarised, and it isn't just about Brexit. Brexit became an outlet for these deeper differences between who you might call sort of the sort of liberal left and conservatives. I'm being somewhat simplistic, but the value divisions that underpin Remain and Leave have now found their expression in other issues. How you feel about Black Lives Matter, how you feel about cancel culture and political correctness, how you feel about the monarchy, how you feel about Harry and Meghan even. All of these things have sort of become outlets of this deeper divide within our society. And that's very similar to America. I mean, America is more extreme. It's had, people that have been much more aggressive at tapping into that and mobilizing it into politics. It's got a different media landscape. And as you say, it's got a very different history, a long history of populism as well in American politics. But the UK, I think, it does have the foundations for US style culture wars, because we have a political class that is not making room for alternative voices. About 90% of MPs come from the graduate class. Labour MPs are more likely now than Conservatives to have a university degree. They are culturally in a galaxy of their own. We've got a number of studies now that show that, especially on the left of British politics, the cultural attitudes that dominate the Labour Parliamentary Party, Labour activists and so forth are just very disconnected from wider society. We have a media that I would argue has not responded well to Brexit. It's not opened up to viewpoint diversity. I think one of the reasons why there's emerged a space for platforms like GBNews is because of the failure of mainstream media to actually give voice to many of those views and many of those values in British society. And we have, I would argue, a sort of cultural class within that is very determined to stigmatize alternative values and voices as being somehow beyond the pale, as being somehow unacceptable. So we've got this sort of dogmatism that has bled into the British system as well. And that's really created this sort of climate, which I think is very similar in some respects to the US. And many of the arguments that the sort of progressive activists like to make, they like to draw these very simplistic comparisons to America, I think feed into that, because they sort of present Britain as being a sort of mini America that is also sort of blighted by, sort of slavery and kind of segregation and, all of this stuff that happened in America, but didn't happen in the United Kingdom. We have a completely different history, where the UK, certainly historically, the empire was involved with some parts of that, but also took a leading role in the abolition of slavery. The migration flows into the UK were completely different from the experience of migration and slavery in the United States. The story of progress among minority communities has been radically different from the United States. And all of these things are sort of conveniently thrown out of the window. And so actually, we are similar to America. And that, I think, reached its peak during 2020, I think, in the pandemic and the lockdown, I think, where you saw this sudden conflation of the United States with the United Kingdom, and suddenly the George Floyd protests, the Black Lives Matter debate essentially became it was, I guess, exported or imported into the UK with no real sense of nuance, no real kind of context. And that's really unfortunate, because we now have a lot of people in schools and universities that I think are somehow equating the two. And we have I would argue, a much more positive story. And unless we get that nuance out, that complexity, that positivity, then we will end up replicating the US. And I think that's really a depressing place to be. And we need people who are in influential, important institutions to remember that actually our story is very different, and to point to that nuance and to say, actually, there is bad, but there is also good, and we need to discuss that in a balanced way.
Do you have much optimism that this can move in that direction? Do you think that people coming into the academy, or people, younger people perhaps, might have that courage? Because one of the questions that I get a lot is, people say that they feel the way that I do about certain issues, but they just don't have the courage to speak out. I was at a conference recently where a young person was saying that she wanted to be more vocal about her views at university, she was employed somewhere, and she was saying she was concerned that she wouldn't get any more promotion, she wouldn't get anywhere in her career if she did so. And that's a legitimate fear. I don't quite know what to say in those circumstances, because my instinct is, well, we all need to be braver. Everyone needs to come out and say, take a stand against these things. But the truth is that if I advise someone to do that, and then their career suffers as a result, that would make me feel very, very bad. So is it just the case that there's going to have to be some sacrifices? Some people are going to have to, I suppose, bear the brunt of it in order for progress to be made overall?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I think a lot of careers and a lot of lives are going to be ruined along the way, and we can already see that. I think in my world of higher education, I am waiting to see what impact the new legislation around academic freedom has. My hypothesis, my hope, is that actually once you pass a bill, which the Conservative government have brought, which is essentially going to require universities not just to protect viewpoint diversity, but promote it. Once you have something like that in place, my hope is that the bureaucracy will kick into gear. We will have academic freedom league tables. We will have a culture that is much more receptive to the promotion of intellectual diversity and intellectual freedom. That's my hope. I know many close friends of mine would say I'm being naive and that actually that won't happen. If it doesn't happen, the only way forward, I would say reluctantly, is that there will have to be parallel structures of some description. There will have to be independent universities, or there will have to be independent forums that will be set up specifically to promote the values of the Enlightenment, and are specifically set up similar to Heterodox Academy in the US or the Hoover Institution at Stanford, among others, that are specifically set up to actually encourage and promote what you might call non-conformist views. Now, that is not an ideal scenario. I do not want to advocate that scenario, because I think we need to try and encourage existing institutions to open up. But unless the media are going to allow more working class voices, non-graduate voices, unless universities are going to allow more gender critical scholars, conservative scholars, Brexit scholars, etc., into their institutions and not be punished, have those scholars punished for doing so, we're not going to create that environment that we need. I can't tell you, Andrew, how many emails I've had from junior academics and many people who say are finishing their masters and saying, actually, I really love a career in academia. I'd love to go into this, but I just don't think I could be myself. I just don't think I could say what I want to say or even research what I want to say without it having negative consequences. And so they go into the private sector, and those voices are essentially channeled out of these institutions, and they just, they go into banking or whatever else, and that's it. And you just never hear from them or see them again. And I think we're going to have to, in the 2020s, I think this is a massive decade, a crunch decade for this debate. I think we're going to really have to watch carefully how these institutions respond to this desperate need for viewpoint diversity. Is the BBC going to do a better job than it has done historically? Are the universities going to open up? Is local government and schools and etc., are they going to go 100 miles an hour after the American model, or are they going to say, hang on, wait, our experience is very different, we need to actually go down a different line? And that's going to require leaders. It's going to require very brave people to stand up and make those arguments, like you're doing, and among others. And as you know, there are huge consequences for that. It's not a pleasant place to be when you're on Twitter experiencing harassment and abuse and intimidation and so on a daily basis. That's not an easy place to be, but hopefully there'll be the few who do put their heads above the parapet. Hopefully that opens the gates for moderates and many others to stand up and say, actually, yeah, I think this is crazy. I think we need to stop this.
Well, I think although you've painted quite a depressing picture, you've also shown us that there's the potential for a way out, and for which I'm very grateful. Thank you very much for joining me today, Matthew.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me on Free Speech Nation, the podcast, with my guest, Matthew Goodwin. If you're so inclined, check out his many books, including National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. And if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, do all the usual stuff, and then come back and join us next week, where we'll have another brilliant guest. Farewell.